here with Tracy Silverman, and Tracy is an amazing musician. He's a violinist, he's a composer, he's a producer. He's played all kinds of styles of music, from contemporary classical music to avant-garde jazz to rock to new age and acoustic music. He's recorded albums on the Windham Hill label and worked with groups like the Turtle Island String Quartet. He's worked a lot with the pianist Jim Brickman, the composer Terry Riley. He played the world premiere of John Adams' The Dharma at Big Sur to open the Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA. He's done it all. He's a huge artist who crosses genres all over the place. And I've been fortunate to work with him a couple of times here at YOSA. And so, Tracy, thanks for being with us today. It's great to have you with us.
Great to see you again, man. It was so much fun the last time I was down there working with all your wonderful kids, and such a great organization. So it's a pleasure to be involved with you guys.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Thank you. Hey, what are you up to these days? What is pandemic life like for Tracy Silverman?
Well, it's been very domestic, but I've been very busy actually here in my studio. It's kind of been a blessing of time in a way, to have all of this time in my studio that I'm often running around in and out on the road. And, playing concerts on the road is not just those hours that you're on stage. There's all of the travel to and from, and then there's all of the preparation before you even leave the house, practicing new material, blah, blah, blah. So, it takes up a lot more time than a lot of people may think. Just, running out and doing a few gigs here or there tends to be a full-time gig. And so it's been really nice to just be home. And what I've been doing actually for the last couple of months is working on an online course, a video course of my Strumboeing method, which is this way that I've been teaching string players how to groove. So it's kind of my mission in my career has really been to liberate string players. That's the way I like to think of it. Really I've been focused on the idea of getting strings back to where they used to be hundreds of years ago, and until pretty much the 20th century, all through the history of stringed instruments, which is that they were playing contemporary music, the popular music of their day, whether that was old folk dances, in ancient times, or during the Dark Ages and through the Renaissance, and these things turned into courants and bourrées and the Baroque and the Viennese style for Mozart and the Russian school for Tchaikovsky. Whatever it was, strings were always there playing the popular music of the time, except for kind of more recently, where strings have been more focused on playing music of the past, as just to generalize the classical technique. And while that is certainly a great thing to spend our time on, because there are so many amazing masterpieces of the past, I think it is somebody's job, and it's partly been mine, to try to bring string playing into the 21st century, and to try to relate it a little closer to the music that's all around us, our contemporary musical culture, rather than a culture of the past, our culture, which is hip hop, jazz, rock and roll that I was raised on, and all that kind of stuff. So I got this, method of Strumboeing, that's what that is. And so I've been shooting a lot of video for that. And that's been occupying my days.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
And for those of you who are listening, if you're string players, if you go out to YouTube right now and type in Tracy Silverman Strumboeing, you can already get some sense of a little bit of an introduction to the style with some materials that are already out there on the internet. And Tracy's been a real great advocate for thinking about how the right hand as a bowed string player could work more like the right hand for a guitarist, essentially, in the way that
Right.
a funk guitarist or a rhythm guitarist in rock and roll generates energy and pulse with the way the pick moves back and forth. We can do the same thing with our bow. I know I don't play much in public these days, but I know the workshop you did on Strumboeing when you came to work with YOSA the first time really changed my thinking just as about how to retake the bow and how to use the bow to kind of dig in on syncopated rhythms. And you know,
Yeah.
it just really had a huge, and that was just from an hour. So I can't wait to see more and see what
Oh,
you've been doing.
thanks, man. Thanks. Well, you hit the nail on the head. You know, the real crux of a lot of what I've been doing for the last 20, 30 years is this idea of being a rhythm string player, like a rhythm guitar player. So that either you're in a rhythm section where you're playing with the bass and the drums, playing rhythm, or even by yourself, just completely self-sufficient, like a guitar player would be for a singer or for another instrumentalist. And this idea of playing rhythm on our instruments is kind of a paradigm shift for strings, especially for upper strings, because we're not a chord instrument. We never consider ourselves a chord instrument. We're set up to play, you know, the bridge is round so that we can play one string at a time, so we can play melodies. And it's such an expressive instrument, and we can play with such a sort of vocal like quality of the voice, and so much expression that we can get out of these strings with a bow and all of that, that it's very tempting to think that's all we can do. Just as it's very tempting to look at the incredible masterpieces of Bach and Tchaikovsky and Beethoven and Brahms and say that's all that strings can do. It's easy to get you know, seduced by this embarrassment of riches, you know, of the instrument and of the repertoire. But we just scratched the surface. We haven't even really gotten into understanding how strings can function as rhythm instruments. And I probably wouldn't have thought that was the case if I hadn't started playing 6-string violins many, many years ago, like back in the 80s, before they had such a thing, and I had to build my own. But having those 2 lower strings doesn't just allow you to kind of play down in the cello range, which it does, but it changes something very fundamental, and that is having that extra lower octave means that you can play bass notes, just like a guitar can. It's kind of like the difference between a ukulele and a guitar. You know, ukulele can play chords, but they can't really play bass notes the way we need that extra octave register. That's just the way our ears are set up in order for that to feel like a real true bass note. And guitars can do that with that lower register. And when I started playing 6-string violins, I realized, oh, I cannot, you know, I don't have to just play lower melodies with those notes. I can actually accompany myself now playing chords. So that changed everything, because now the instrument truly could become a rhythm instrument. And that's kind of, then I had to figure out, well, how do you play chords? You know, how do you do that without a pick? How do you do that with a bow? And that's kind of how I started this whole Strumboeing thing.
Well, and I'd love to take it to roll things back a little bit from there and think back to when you were growing up, when you were a teenager, studying the violin, coming up,
Yep.
you know, probably playing the same kind of standard repertoire that most of us play in school orchestra and places like that. How did you, first of all, how did you find your way into music in general? How did you decide you wanted to be a musician? And then, you know, what's the thing that led you down this path to be somebody with I think a unique career in straddling different genres and really being able to play in just a ton of different styles? How'd you get there? What was the path that led you into this multifaceted career in music?
Well, good question. I guess to start off, I was very fortunate in that I had parents who were music lovers. My dad especially was really into classical music, had a great record collection of LPs, and was also a big jazz fan. So I had a lot of jazz records. And so I had this great privilege of having this available to me at an early age. And so that, you know, was really helpful in just exposing me to so much incredible music by the age of 5, I was conducting to, Swan Lake and things like that. And, so that was part of my world. And so by the time I was 8 years old, I was getting good enough on violin to go to Juilliard pre-college, and my parents, really kind of nurtured all of that. My dad used to take me to, drove me, an hour each way to violin lessons when I was 8 years old. And then when we moved outside of to Wisconsin, he would drive me 2 hours to Chicago every Saturday for lessons. So it was 2 hours down, and I'd sit in the lesson for an hour, and he was deputized by my teacher so that when I went home for the week, my dad was allowed to say that E flat is out of tune. He had authority from my teacher. But he, so there was an incredible investment of their time. And I have to acknowledge that for sure. And that sort of really fostered this love of music and appreciation for it. But here I was in high school, loved the Sibelius Violin Concerto, couldn't wait till I was good enough to play that thing when I was about 16 years old. But I was that kid in school who used to, walk around with a violin case and had glasses and curly hair and, was named Tracy. And so it was not an easy path for me in high school. I realized as much as I loved the Sibelius Violin Concerto, none of my friends had any clue about Sibelius. They were listening to Led Zepp and Jimi Hendrix and Frank Zappa and whoever, Eric Clapton. And I desperately wanted to be cool because I was just super nerd, dyed in the wool, just everything about me. And so, I started to realize that all of these great pieces that I loved, like Sibelius and Tchaikovsky and stuff, they were written, they were the electric guitar concertos of their day. They were like the rock and roll, the rock stars. And I was like, well, geez, if Tchaikovsky were alive today, maybe he would write an electric guitar concerto instead of electric violin concerto. And isn't that what I should be doing if I want to be the next Tchaikovsky or something? Because I was always a composer from an early age. And I felt like, it's time for somebody to, make an electric version of the violin and treat that like what Jimi Hendrix did with the electric guitar, and to do it on a concert stage, and to make, write electric violin concertos. And that was the beginning of the end. So, that's kind of where it started. I was just trying to sound like a guitar, basically.
Right. And so did you experiment with that as early as high school, or when did you really start to plug in?
Well, I started listening to a lot of rock and roll when I was in high school. I had an older brother. And so not only did I have all my dad's jazz and classical and my mom's show tunes, because she was Broadway show, lover. But I had my big brother's rock and roll, and that was a very extensive collection as well. So I got real familiar with all of 70s rock and stuff like that. So that was, and I realized, that I wanted to play music that my friends would think was cool. And I knew that the thing that they would think was cool was electric guitar. If I could only play an electric guitar, I'd be fine, but I really couldn't play the guitar yet. I'd never really picked up a guitar, but I could play the violin pretty well. I was already like, in Juilliard and or like, getting ready for Juilliard. And so I just tried to sound like a guitar on the violin, and I started building these. Actually, I went to Juilliard after high school. I wanted to do other stuff, but well, I got to Juilliard. I was dying to go to Juilliard. It was my dream to go to the Juilliard school, and I've been practicing and preparing all my life, to do that. Studying really hard when I was right in that age of like 14, 15, 16. Those are the years that I really practiced the hardest, I think, in my whole life. And I had an amazing teacher in Chicago, Deborah Schwartz, who taught me not only how to play the violin, but how to practice, how to learn things, how to teach myself. So, it's sort of like the biblical story, rather than give somebody a fish, you teach them how to fish, and that's what she did. She taught me how to teach myself how to play the violin. And so at any rate, long story short, it was my dream to get to Juilliard. And as soon as I got there, I kind of realized, I didn't really want to be the next Jascha Heifetz. I really wanted to be the next Jimi Hendrix. That's kind of, I started realizing I wanted to sound like a guitar. I wanted to play in the language that my friends understood. They understood Jimi Hendrix. Now, Jimi Hendrix played some of the most heart-rending notes on a guitar. Carlos Santana got some notes out of that guitar that, were just as emotional as anything in the Sibelius Violin Concerto. Anything that I'd heard Jascha Heifetz play, or David Oistrakh, or Nathan Milstein in the Prokofiev concertos, which I just love to death. I would listen to those things over and over and over again, but it was not in the current language. It wasn't it was a language that my friends would think was old-fashioned or something. So I wanted to do that, but do it in a way that my friends would appreciate and would listen to.
Right.
Basically.
Well, and one of the things that's been incredibly striking to me as I've been around you on your visits to San Antonio, I've followed you as a fan on your work, your recordings, and your work elsewhere. I remember really vividly actually watching the Dharma at Big Sur when the Walt Disney Concert Hall opening was broadcast, and just being like, who is this guy? Like being fascinated by your playing in that piece. But anyway, one of the things that's really blown me away in seeing you work up close is your fluency with a variety of styles, with being able to take a Stevie Wonder song, for example, and play it in a way that feels like Stevie Wonder and also feels completely you, where you make it your own. And doing the same thing with solo violin music by Johann Sebastian Bach, and taking a piece by Bach, playing it with a real reverence for the original material, and yet with a willingness to make it your own a little bit, and to take things. And I guess I wonder, that stylistic fluency, clearly that was a mission of yours as a young musician, but what did you do to develop that? How did you learn how to play jazz better, how to play Stevie Wonder better, how to play Nirvana, how to take these different threads and weave them together? You use your ears, obviously, but how'd you do that?
Well, it's a good question. And there were a few things that I really kind of consciously did. And one of the things was, after I graduated from Juilliard, I started building these 6-string instruments and started playing them very loud, but through amps with distortion. And that changes everything. The way you play the instrument, you can't use your bow in the same way. So, part of it was that. But the big difference was, I was playing these electric violins, but I was holding them really low, like down by, like where you would hold a guitar, down on my stomach. And which was, kind of impractical for a violin player. I had a guitar strap, kind of just like a guitar. I was holding it like a little miniature guitar, playing it at first with a full-size bow, but then because the bow, you can't really use more than the bottom part of it down there, you're wasting all the rest of it. I started using little miniature, like quarter-size bows, so that I wouldn't hit the mic stand with it, because I was singing at the same time. But holding it all the way down here forced me to retool my technique in a very fundamental way. I couldn't get out of first position, for one thing, because you can't really shift down here. There's no stability. So I'm just playing kind of rhythm parts down there to accompany myself singing, and holding it down here and trying desperately to sound like a guitar. So I started, and I was doing this for years, for like 10 years in New York, trying to get a record deal and playing all the all the dive clubs in New York and all the fancy clubs and, you know, everything in between. Over the course of those 10 years of just trying to sound as much like a guitar as I could with the gear and the playing technique, I realized that I had kind of developed a whole different way of using my bow. And that's kind of what started the Strumboeing stuff. But I was also doing different things with my vibrato. I was trying to sound like a guitarist, trying to sound like Jimi Hendrix, who I idolized, you know, and get feedback sounds. And I figured out a way to kind of use multiphonics to get something that sounds like a guitar feedback. And I can sort of control the way guitar players can sort of control feedback. So it has a very similar place and kind of expressivity that has for me when Santana just like goes up to a feedback and just kind of turns to the amp just the right way to get that note to sustain, and, you know, all that kind of rock and roll stuff. I guess, you know, the short answer is it came from listening very carefully to guitar players and really not settling for okay. And I kept just trying to, I can make that amp sound better. Maybe I need a different amp. Maybe I should try different strings. Maybe a different bow would work better. Let me try to build another violin. This time I'm going to make it hollower and not so solid. And this little research and development, process went on for about 30 years, you know, and it's still in progress. And I'm constantly changing gears and tweaking my sound and figuring out ways to make it sound a little better. But it was really those 10 years of holding my fiddle down here changed my technique so dramatically. I knew when I was holding it up here, when I started off playing, I sounded like Stefan Grappelli, or I sounded like Jean-Luc Ponty, and I was like, I don't want to sound like, I want to sound like a guitar player. I love Jean-Luc, but I wanted to sound like a guitar player, not a violin player. And I wanted to sound like Miles Davis, and I wanted to sound like John Coltrane. I didn't want to sound like a string player really at all. So, you know, that really colored the type of technique that I developed. I was looking for something that was really not idiomatic to strings, but more idiomatic to guitar and jazz instruments.
Now, what role does music theory play in all this? You know, you do a lot of improvising and you do a lot of modal playing where you're working with, maybe some recurring composed material, but kind of manipulating it. So that's improv too, but you're not starting maybe from zero. But how did you get your ear and your brain to that point where or was that something you were always good at? How does that integrate? You know what I mean? That thing of I'm playing F sharp Dorian versus just your fingers being an F sharp Dorian. How much of it is muscle memory? How much of it is you processing what's on a chart, all of those things.
Yeah.
How does that?
Well, that is such an interesting area that I think about a lot as a teacher, you know, when I'm teaching this to students. And, you know, I hate to use the word theory because it just sounds so dry and boring. I prefer to just think of it as harmony, because harmony is so collaborative and musical. So that's for one thing. But I've always been somebody who relied more on my ear than on my brain. And I think we're all sort of, to generalize with the right brain, left brain thing, which is somewhat, been disputed. But I think we do tend to, as musicians, tend to fall into those two camps. Either we tend to play by ear and we don't really think much about what we're playing. We just kind of go on instinct. Or we're going, okay, here are some constructs, here are some patterns, here are some finger patterns, here are some, and for me, it's always been kind of a balance of the two, where I try to make it a yin yang. So it's kind of, I have a sense intellectually about what's going on, but I also try not to let that get in the way. I sort of have an awareness just from there's only 12 notes. So, after a while you get used to the various patterns and okay, this is doing this is doing that. But I've always stressed to my students to lead with your ear, understand afterwards if you want to go back and become aware of what you've been doing. But I think it was Coleman Hawkins or no, Ornette Coleman, I think, who said, you don't need to learn how to spell to learn how to talk, right? You don't have to know how to spell to talk. So you don't, you can be a great musician and have no, and not really understand or be able to express to others what you're doing. Now it's unusual because usually by the time you spent your life in music and have developed any kind of mastery, you've got an awareness of how you got there. And when Miles Davis and Coltrane and Parker were inventing bebop and all that kind of stuff, they knew exactly what they were doing. There was no, they weren't just shooting in the dark. They knew theory-wise what was going on with altered dominance and all of that kind of chromatic harmony. It's good to know, it's good to understand it. I think when you understand things in a conscious way, it makes it much more useful. So yes, if you want to be consistent, dig down and figure out what you did right. Figure out something you like and go figure out, why does that sound so good? What is it? This is the way I teach my kids. I go like, okay, pull out a chorus of a Coltrane solo or a Miles Davis solo, and then find that measure or two that you just love. There's like that line that's just perfect, right? It's like melodically just right, rhythmically. It's just, what is it about that line that makes it work so well? And figure out harmonically what's going on, timing wise, what's going on, what's making that magic happen. If you want to be able to recreate things as a musician, you have to look really closely. You have to be observant, or with your ears, you have to really listen and understand at least what you're imitating and what you're shooting for.
Right. Sometimes the things that your ear leads you to the first time can be these sort of magical moments, but you go back afterwards and say, oh, I moved from C major to A flat major there, and that added sixth in A flat major sounded great. Okay, so I'm going to put that in my bag of tricks, and
right.
I'm going to know that if I go to flat six with an that, but you don't. So it can be a mix, right?
Absolutely, I think it has to be. I think it has to be.
And for those of us who spend most of our time as classical musicians, we can get too tied to the page sometimes, for sure, because so much of our job is if we're not reproducing what's on the page, we're not doing our job.
Well, this is a big issue that I have, with the classical pedagogy. Now, I was brought up on classical pedagogy, so I owe my career to it, so this is coming with love. But just as we don't think of our instruments as chordal instruments, but we can use them that way. Now, you can be a guitar player and go into your very first lesson and not know a single chord, not know where to put your fingers anywhere on the frets, but you can just strum the open strings, right? So there are certain things that's not hard to strum. We're just never taught how to do that as string players. Like my little motto that I love to say is, if guitar players can do it, how hard could it be? So it's not hard, it's just different. It's not the way the instrument is taught. Now, the same thing goes for improvisation. It's not really hard to improvise. We do it. We're doing it right now with our words. We're having a conversation. I didn't plan to say this. You didn't know what you were going to ask me, because I might have an idea, but we're rolling with it. We're just free falling, and all of our conversations, this one and every other one that we have for the most part during the day, unless we've rehearsed something we want to say to somebody, is off the top of our head. We're improvising. We do that as little children. We learn how to talk in our language. And that's why I think it's so important for string players to learn the language that surrounds us of music. Because if you want to talk to people in a language that they understand, you have to speak their language, But, getting off the page is not hard. It's not hard. Classical musicians know how to do that. If I say to somebody, play a D major scale, you don't need it written down. You can play a D major scale. And if I say, okay, well, play a D major scale while this band is jazz band is playing in D major behind you, you can do that. Now, you may not sound idiomatic to jazz. You might not sound like a sax player, but that's probably because you haven't really listened to the language. Just like you haven't, if you want to speak French, you need to listen to the French language spoken. You need to know what the sounds of the vowels are, what an R sounds like in French as opposed to Spanish or something like that. Those, that understanding of the language, of the idiom, only comes from being absorbed in it. There's just no other way to learn that, and so for classical musicians, it's partly that they're terrified of not having notes in front of them, which they shouldn't be. And the other half of that is that they're not familiar with the language. They're just haven't spent enough time listening to jazz or listening to rock or listening to hip hop or whatever it is, bluegrass, whatever they're trying to play. And, because most classical musicians have great ears and are already trained musicians, that absorption time that it would take them to absorb a second language like jazz is really not as long as they think. Right. You spend a few weeks copying Miles Davis, and before you know it, you sound like Miles Davis,
Right. Yeah. You may not be quite at the level of Miles Davis, right? But you can credibly speak the language, right?
Yeah, at least you can imitate
English. It doesn't make you Shakespeare, but you learn
exactly.
how to speak English, right?
Exactly. You may not, come up with, poetry on your own, but at least you can imitate the language, right, and repeat somebody else's poetry,
So here's a question for you, and I don't know whether this is a fair question or not, but I'm going to put it out there. When have you fallen on your face?
Yeah.
So you're somebody who's not afraid to take risks. You're somebody who's not afraid to explore different musical styles. Have you ever walked into a collaborative project or some other kind of just a rehearsal and gone, oh man, I'm in over my head. I've got to adjust, or I've got to figure out how to do this better.
I'm sure many times. I'm trying to think off the top of my head any particularly embarrassing moments.
Well, I'm not trying to embarrass you. I just want, what's the journey as a musician when you go, all right, I need to do some homework, or I need to connect these dots.
It raises a more fundamental question that I think is interesting. Not sure any of our listeners will, but which is, as a performer, the difference between being a creative musician and being a performing musician, especially in the classical world, are very different. Now, in jazz, it's supposed to be the same thing, right? We're supposed to be improvising while on the bandstand, while the microphone is on in front of the public, and you're expected to improvise solos and kind of like freestyle and rap or something. People are going to applaud or cheer you depending on how well you can think on your feet, right? And how quick-witted you are if you're a freestyle rapper or something, and how much, how good an improviser you are. The reality of it is that we're rarely reinventing the wheel when we're on the jazz bandstand. We're usually reconfiguring riffs, phrases, I don't want to say cliches, but parts of language. I'm using words, right? I'm not reinventing the English language. I'm just using words, putting them together in my own way. And on when you're improvising jazz, it's a lot of that. You're playing a 2-5-1 pattern in this key, and you've played 100 of them before, so you're bound to say something you've said before, or very similar to something you said, or something similar to what Charlie Parker said or somebody else did, because after all, there's only 12 notes. Mm-hmm. So my point is, a lot of times improvising is not a totally creative process in the sense of we're not completely reinventing something in front of people, right? But that process does happen in the studio. That process happens when I'm sitting at the keyboard or sitting with my fiddle and writing a tune and failing over and over again, in the sense that it didn't come out exactly the way I'm picturing it or the way that I'm satisfied with. And just like a writer, if you imagine in the old fashioned world, there's a typewriter, you pull the paper out, crumble it up, throw it in the garbage, and that's a writer. I'm writing my novel and I've just thrown away 40 pieces of paper till I got a good sentence, right? That process, that creative process, that truly creative process where you're failing 99% of the time, let's say, for your one great sentence, you can't do on stage. You don't get to do that on stage. People have paid tickets to see you play. They don't want to see you fail 99 times out of 100, right? To get something good. So it's a compromise. And while, yes, there's always some improvisation going on, a lot more in jazz than there is in classical music. There used to be a lot more in classical music, a lot of improvisation in the Baroque era and things like that. Classical music has gotten to a point where people get up on stage and it's a little bit like the Olympics, where you try to play something flawlessly. And I don't want to put a bad spin on any of that, but for me, it wasn't creative enough to feel like I was able to, I wasn't putting enough of myself in that. I was playing the Sibelius with all of my heart, but it sounded an awful lot like David Oistrakh playing the Sibelius with all of his heart, as opposed to playing my own concerto or something like that. So, I think there's a continuum of creativity, and that we all choose a place on, and we're not all creators. A lot of us are interpreters of other people's writing or composition. And that's fine too. So my path was, as a composer, somebody who composed all my life, I was definitely looking for a way to do that, and just discovered that it's really difficult in the classical world to be that creative on stage. It's even difficult in the jazz world, frankly.
Right. So, well, interestingly though, you are somebody who has played a lot of music composed by other people. You've had these prominent pieces written for you by John Adams, Nico Muhly, Kenji Bunch, and you and others, and you are an interpreter in that case.
Yeah.
I have the sense that sometimes you're a bit of a collaborator too, as soloists often are with a new piece. But how is that process different when you have a piece handed to you by somebody like John Adams and you start learning the piece? How do you keep how much do you keep your own personal kind of creative voice in that process? And what's that balance like?
Well, I think it's different for every collaboration, every work. With John Adams, it was a fascinating process of showing him everything that I could do on the instrument, all these non-traditional kind of more rock and jazz things, and Indian classical kind of language a little bit that I was involving, having worked with Terry Riley and stuff like that, that John was interested in for that piece. Mm-hmm. And then having him kind of like write a piece that fit me like a glove, that just sounded like me if I was a great composer. You know what I mean? It was like, it was exactly what I would have played if I was as great a composer as John Adams. And but it was totally in my voice and that kind of thing. And like having somebody like custom make a suit for you, and different, working with Terry Riley, who had also very clear ideas of what he wanted to do, but allowed me to take some of these ideas and reinterpret them a little bit using violin, more idiomatic violin technique, and he gave me a lot of freedom. Working with Kenji Bunch was a wonderful experience, which we did together Embrace. And that was a piece that was written intentionally to give me a lot of collaborative space. And you as the conductor, which is really kind of unusual for a concerto type of situation. You know, when conductors have to do the concerto part of the concert, it's I think a lot of them, you know, feel like, okay, you know, this is the part of the concert where I don't really get to be the interpreter. The soloist has that kind of you know, prerogative and that option. And you know, the job of the conductor is to be a little more supportive and you know, to allow the soloist to be the one. But in this piece, in Embrace, it was really open for the conductor to figure out how to use the orchestra, because it was intended to be played by a lot of different kinds of groups. And it was a wonderful balance of this collaboration, you know, a really collaborative spirit that involved the whole orchestra. So, you know, it's different every time. And, you know, yeah, I think the funny thing with John, you know, just to say, like, you know, that interpreting other people's music rather than my own, I think, you know, he wanted to work together on that piece because I had taken this non-classical trajectory. I'd started off in classical, could read music, could play more or less in tune, things like that, but had spent years playing in metal bands and playing and accompanying myself singing and, you know, being in rock clubs, and then played with Terry Riley and played with Turtle Island, and I had jazz and I had Indian. And it was because of that crazy eclectic mix that's just, you know, luckily what he happened to be looking for in that piece. You know, right. Otherwise he would have gotten Itzhak Perlman or somebody much more famous.
Well, it's so funny though, because this is a side note, but that piece is so quintessentially Californian to me. You know, it's a piece that obviously was written for a major event in California and is inspired, at least to some degree, by geography in California. And of course, Terry Riley has big California connections. And, you know, I think of you as a Chicago and New York guy. But of course, you know, that's part of a musician's job, right? Is to be able to speak a lot of different languages. And obviously your work with Terry Riley, you were fluent in that style. But, you know, I've never really thought about that until today. Just the fact that, you know, John is a California composer, that whole thing, just, you know, you're not totally a California guy, although you fit in out there. Don't worry.
Well, I lived there for years, actually. I did live in the Bay Area when I was with Turtle Island through the 90s.
Right. Okay. All right. I withdraw.
So I got a little bit of that. But, you know, like most East Coasters, you know, my dream was to eventually get to California, the promised land. And John, by the way, is from Connecticut. John.
Sure,
Adams.
That's true. But he's been originally out there since the 70s too. So, you know.
Yeah.
But so now you're in Nashville. So
I am.
What's the path, you know, New York, Chicago, New York, California, Nashville? What, you know, did you move to Nashville because of the music scene?
Kinda. I moved, I didn't move here with any gig or anything like that. And I actually almost never work in town here. Just because I'm on the road a lot, and except for like in my studio, I work, but in terms of like studios and stuff like that, I don't do a ton of that. Occasionally stuff like that. But I just figured it's Music City, you know, there's a ton of musicians. Nashville is kind of like LA is for film and TV. You know, everybody here is a songwriter, practically, it feels like. And I felt like it, you know, at some point I'm going to want to get off the road and just be able to work a little closer to home. So this seemed like a good place to land. We were living out in California at the time, and it was right around 2000 when we moved. And it was the first .com craziness, and California real estate just went crazy. You had to be a millionaire to live there. And I decided I wanted to remain a musician, which rather than have to go into finance or something else to be able to afford to live there. So Nashville was just a lot more affordable. And so I came over here.
Cool. Well, I guess I want to wrap up with this question. You know, you're somebody who's had this rich and varied career. In the last couple of years, it's been clear you've had an interest in teaching, and especially in terms of passing along some of what you've learned about Strumboeing technique and, having developed kind of your own language of string playing. But when you think of this next chapter of your career, I don't want to say last chapter of your career because you're still a young man,
Oh,
but when you
yes.
look ahead to the next decade, what do you want to do? What else is there? What else is there in your life in music that you'd like to explore further, or are there new horizons you want to chase after?
Well, I've been thinking, I turned 60 this year. So I'm giving a little bit of thought to kind of documenting what I've been doing. I haven't written down hardly any of the pieces that I've been playing for years in concert, a lot of the solo arrangements and the looping stuff. And, there's lots of video of it online. But I thought, maybe I should just write this stuff down and sort of have a definitive version that I sort of approve, that's transcribed properly, that kind of thing. Put in the bowings that I use so that other people, it's funny, for a while in my career, I was like, I don't want anybody to figure out how I'm doing this, right? I've got this magic thing that I'm doing, and I don't want anybody to steal my secrets. And now I'm like, I want everybody to steal my secrets. I'm trying to show you, here's how I do it. I can write the bowing out for you. I'm going to explain it over the course of 60 lessons on this video thing that I'm doing. And so I'm really kind of dedicated to this idea right now of getting my stuff documented. I've been working on this video course, really showing people, at least as far as I've gotten with it, only so that somebody else can sort of stand on my shoulders and take it further. Because I feel like there are kids out there, there may be kids out there who have never even really heard a violin before, or never realized they heard a violin before, who may hear some music that I'm doing that doesn't sound like a violin. It sounds like a guitar, some weird kind of guitar. I just finished, by the way, a record of hip hop stuff that I've been doing with my son, who is 13. He is in 8th grade. He did a lot of these beats when he was 12. But they're hip hop beats like trap and boom bap and lo-fi and stuff like that. And I've been playing with it in a way that doesn't sound, a lot of it, like a violin. Doesn't really sound like a guitar, doesn't quite sound like a saxophone. It's just sort of this weird thing. And my dream is that some kids are going to hear this and go, oh, I want to sound like that. What kind of keyboard is that? What kind of, that's really cool, and go, that's a violin. Oh, I want one of those, and take it further into our vernacular, into our, our current musical culture, which is really dominated by hip hop in the pop music world. And, I wasn't raised with hip hop. First of all, I'm way older than that, and so I think it really depends on young people. It depends on kids who are in their teens, maybe in their early 20s, to take a look at what I did with the violin, to take it one step out of classical music, and then maybe work on that and figure out other ways that they can bring it much more authentically into that, into our vernacular than I can, without being colored by all my classical ears. And I've got Prokofiev rolling around back there, and Sibelius, along with Coltrane and Hendrix and Miles Davis and all of that kind of stuff. But they're going to be people who have just come up with hip hop and rappers and things like that, who are going to take a violin and do something I never would do with it. And that's what I'm hoping. That's why I'm trying to get this stuff down, so that people can start from a little bit further point and then take it further.
Right. Well, Tracy, thanks so much for joining us today. It was really great to chat with you. Really great to see you again.
Always good to see you, Troy.
Yeah, and we need to work together again.
Absolutely, man.
I look forward to doing that again, because you just are so full of music and bring so much joy to the stage.
Oh, thanks.
So,
and I just have to say, for anybody out there who is not familiar with the work that you are doing with that community there, changing lives through music, it's remarkable. And I bow down to you and the great team that you had there, because it takes a lot of people to make that happen.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got a lot of great kids.
Yeah.
We're missing them all. We're looking forward to hopefully being able to get some of them back in the same room again
Yeah.
sometime, hopefully. So,
Yeah.
but next week, next Sunday on July 5th, we're going to have our next YOSA live chat. We're going to have Brian Santero, who's the principal trombonist of the New York City Ballet Orchestra and one of the most exciting young brass players in America today. And so I hope you will tune in next Sunday, July 5th, as we chat with Brian Santero. Tracy Silverman, thanks again. And thanks to
Welcome.
everybody who joined us today on YOSA Live Chats.